An unusual story. It happened in the castle of the Great Crumble Hill. A beautiful girl named Amber, whose eyes reflected the pain of the decision she had made. She was standing in front of a broad-shouldered man. Jim was Amber's husband and looked at her with hidden passion. Just as Jim was about to kiss Amber, she revealed her family's terrible secret. She was not her mother's biological daughter. Feeling guilty, the girl could not stay in Jim's arms and moved away from him, but Jim was not worried, especially about Amber's secret. He approached her again and gently tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. Amber was captivated by her husband and didn't realize that the next second, he was kissing her passionately. Jim's passion overwhelmed him, leaving out all his emotions, and pushed Amber onto the bed. She was filled with horror when she saw his naked body, because she had never seen anything like it before. Jim continued covering her body with kisses. Despite her desperate defensive attitude, Amber covered her face with her hand so that Jim wouldn't see her tears. He had no time for her tears. He wanted to make her pay for the deception, but he was able to stop himself. The girl understood that if she didn't finalize the divorce, she would fall in love again and everything would end. Jim was the emperor's nephew and named commander-in-chief of his army. Amber was the daughter of a marquis and was distinguished by her extraordinary beauty. One day, she secretly entered a ball that her family was holding in their castle in honor of another celebration, where she was forbidden to enter. Upon seeing her at the ball, her mother became very angry and unleashed all her fury on her. As punishment, Amber's mother locked her in an empty, dirty closet. After sitting there for several hours and completely losing hope, she heard the click of the lock and he appeared at the door. Jim approached Amber and without saying a word, gently took her hand and led her. The couple went out to the balcony overlooking a beautiful garden, but no one dared to break the silence. Jim looked at Amber and understood that she was still very young, just a child, but he had his own goal of getting to know her. Deep down, he felt uncomfortable being near her and didn't know how to start a conversation. But suddenly, breaking the sound of silence, Amber asked what the name of her savior was. Unexpectedly for him, Jim was captivated by her voice. He introduced himself and told a little about himself, but this was their last conversation. Many years later, Jim not only became a war hero, but also received lands in East Mason and a majestic castle. After receiving the title of Duke, Jim proposed to Amber and they got married. Amber was happy to finally be free from the shackles of her parents and that her destiny was with him. But not everything was so rosy. One morning, Amber went to wish her husband good morning, to which the Duke responded with some cruelty. Jim didn't understand why she came to him, or what she wanted to achieve with it. Jim's harsh words hurt Amber's heart, and she couldn't answer him anymore. The Duke said he could do anything, from renovating the castle to organizing receptions. However, he asks her not to bother him anymore with her presence. And with these words, Amber leaves the room. She was left alone thinking about why he had married her if he was so indifferent towards her. Jim was always busy with his own matters, so Amber was always alone. Even during meals, she wondered what was going on with her husband, why he was so cold to her. If she had done something wrong, her thoughts were interrupted by a maid who entered the dining room and announced that Amber's father had come to see her. At that moment, she was happy, but not because her father had arrived, but because at least for a while she would not be alone. Marquis Morgan Elois was sitting in the living room, looking terribly displeased, because only his daughter came out to greet him. Amber tried to justify Jim, saying he had a lot of work to do at his job, and that's why he couldn't greet the Marquis. Morgan was not satisfied with his daughter's answer, and made some more biting remarks about the Duke. After the Marquis had soothed his vanity, he handed his daughter a strange bottle, and told her to give it to the Duke, to maintain his virility on their wedding night. Amber didn't understand why he needed that strange bottle with questionable contents. As if reading his daughter's thoughts, Morgan explained that it was time to tie him to her so he wouldn't wander around, still very young. Amber was shocked by what her father was offering her. However, Morgan did not give up and pushed the potion toward his daughter again, saying that only a child would secure his position. The Marquis looked at his daughter haughtily and repeated his words, implying that it was her duty. The girl was stunned by her father's words, holding back tears. She still took the bottle and hid it in her box. All day, Amber thought about this strange conversation with her father. She didn't understand how she could do what he asked. Every time she remembered how insistently her father had spoken about using the potion, she felt a wave of heat. There was no doubt on Morgan's face that this was exactly what his daughter had to do for her future, but that was not the future the young woman dreamed of. Clutching the bottle to her chest, the conversation between father and daughter ended as strangely as it had begun, and Morgan, throwing words of contempt at the Duke, left. Amber was left alone again and cared for her father, hoping he would say a kind word to her. The girl's expectations were not met. Once again, she realized how alone she was in this world. Returning from her memories, the girl decided to ask the local doctor what kind of medicine her father had given her. An hour later, the Duke Jim received a visitor. This visitor turned out to be Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Elois, who was looking for Jim to deliver a letter from the Emperor. Upon handing the letter to the Duke, Morgan pointed out that the message was very important, and therefore, the Emperor had ordered it to be delivered. Jim chuckled and said that the old Marquis was very fitting for the role of messenger. Morgan was enraged by the insolent boy's words and counterattacked. The Marquis accused the Duke of disloyalty to the throne, and that Morgan was there to restore order. Upon learning of the disloyalty to the throne, James gave a sarcastic smile, lost in his thoughts. The Duke said that his marriage to the Marquis's daughter was already a sign of devotion, and that he didn't understand what more the Emperor wanted. The old Marquis, with an air of importance, began to talk about how he and Amber needed to have a child, and then the Emperor would leave him alone. However, Jim wasn't that stupid and understood what Morgan meant. The birth of a child meant giving up the title. It was then that Jim realized what they wanted, an heir they could control. The Marquis tried to convince the Duke that this would not be a good omen, since the heir would be his own son and the child would have his blood. After thinking for a moment, the Duke replied that he could not object if that was what the Emperor wanted, but he also added that since for the Emperor, the main thing is that the heir has his blood. It is not so important who the mother will be. Morgan shouted at the Duke's words. He could not accept such audacity. Jim immediately explained that he could not have children with the Marquis's daughter, because when he looked at her, he saw Morgan in her, who was unpleasant to him. Without waiting for the old man's response, the Duke stood up proudly and left. Morgan was so insolent that he couldn't even articulate a couple of words. He had never met such an insolent person before. Jim and his servants had already left the room by then, walking with their heads held high, completely unaware of the old man's incoherent shouts. The Marquis, who remained in the room, finally managed to control himself and promised the Duke that he would still pay for his words. The next morning, sitting in the dining room having breakfast, Jim was reading a letter from the Emperor when Amber suddenly appeared at the door. She moved like a swan on the water, and if she weren't who she was, maybe something could have worked out for them. Sitting at the table, Amber almost immediately felt sad because her husband wasn't paying attention to her as usual. Jim continued reading the letter, and only after a while said he was going to see the Emperor before Amber had time to think about being alone again. The Duke announced that she would come too. Her joy knew no bounds. She would finally leave the castle and have a good time. Amber spent a few moments lost in her thoughts, wondering how everything would go, what she should bring with her, what she should wear, and how she should behave. But as soon as she turned her attention back to Jim, all the joy disappeared and he became distant again. Jim, meanwhile, recalled the past and thought about what else the Emperor needed, why he still didn't trust the Duke, his nephew. After all, it was the Duke who, from age 17, dedicated himself to the Empire, fought for the Emperor's lands. Jim has thousands of debts on his back and has walked through life all this time, stepping over mountains of corpses. He even agreed to marry the old Marquis's daughter, servant of the Emperor, and even after this they dared to accuse him of infidelity. After finishing breakfast, Jim decided to leave, telling Amber only that he would leave first. Amber, like a devoted wife, wished him a good trip and continued eating. Despite her husband's coldness, she was glad they had spent that morning together and that they had a trip ahead of them. The imperial palace was so majestic and powerful that it was impossible to look away from it. Jim arrived first at the palace and, as expected, he bowed before the Emperor. Amber followed him to the palace. She felt uncomfortable being in the Emperor's palace. Emperor Karl Bane and Empress Emily Bane were very welcoming and greeted the Duke and his wife to maintain social conversation. And for reasons of decency, the Duke asked about the Emperor's health. After briefly answering Jim's question, Karl turned to Amber and told her he hadn't been able to see her since the wedding. Amber thanked the Emperor for everything he had done for her well-being. Karl was incredibly happy with Amber's words because he knew how difficult it was to be with a nephew, with his character, and accept him. Jim felt uncomfortable listening to everything the Emperor said, but he couldn't say anything because he was his uncle. Amber liked Karl. He was more affectionate and polite with her than her husband. However, in her soul, a shadow of doubt about his kindness still arose. With this in mind, the Emperor and Empress left the young couple, leaving them alone. At night, the palace looked even more majestic, but at the same time reflected a certain mystery. Jimmy and Amber entered the dining room refreshed, and despite being married, there was a huge gap between them. Also sitting at the table were the Emperor's children, Jax and Alexandria. They were younger than Jim, but behaved majestically. Jim remained silent as always, wanting this dinner to end as quickly as possible. Despite his nephew's behavior, the Emperor was in a good mood, and after drinking wine, he thanked them for visiting the palace. Emily immediately responded to her husband's words, saying it was all thanks to Amber, and Karl agreed, because he was very happy that his nephew had married the daughter of his devoted servant. The girl felt flattered by the Emperor's words. But when Karl began to talk about the child, Amber felt uncomfortable. The conversation about children also did not go unnoticed by Jim, who was perplexed, because his uncle was so concerned about that matter, and began to lead the dialogue aloud. Jax and Alexandria had never heard Jim speak like that before, and were surprised by what was happening. The Duke's next words surprised everyone present. Jim proposed to dissolve his marriage with Amber, to hold back tears, and not show her emotions to those around her. Amber looked down and tightly gripped the hem of her dress in her fists. However, the Empress noticed Amber's reaction and felt sorry for the poor girl. Emily immediately addressed Jim and asked him to stop that dialogue, because such jokes crossed all the limits of what was permissible. However, Karl defended his nephew and said that probably he had done nothing wrong, with obvious sarcasm. Jim responded that of course they had misunderstood him, and that he simply wanted to show his loyalty to the Emperor. The uncle understood his nephew's actions, and both remained seated in great tension, barely containing their emotions. Seeing the flushed expression on the Emperor's face, the Duke felt satisfied with himself and made it clear that he understood where His Highness's actions were leading. The atmosphere at the imperial table was tense to the limit, and only Amber was upset about everything that was happening. She already regretted having gone to the palace with the Duke. Then, unexpectedly for everyone, the rightful heir Jax stood up from his seat, shouting, and turned toward his father. Everyone at the table directed their attention toward Jax, and he, a little confused, began to speak about the upcoming day of the Empire's foundation. The next day, there was a small reception in the palace garden, where high society gathered. When Amber appeared in the garden, all the women began to congratulate her, clearly trying to become her friend. She felt uncomfortable with so much attention, because she was always alone in the Duke's castle. One of the young women asked where she lived, Amber now, so they could see each other in the future, but she no longer listened to them. The girl was lost in her thoughts. About the past dinner with the Duke's relatives, she repeated Jim's words many times in her head about ending the marriage, and each time she became more convinced that most likely he did not want that union. Completely lost in her thoughts, Amber suddenly heard a voice that gave her chills down her spine. It was her mother Anna, a majestic woman, with bright red hair and an unpleasant smile. The woman acted like a loving mother, which made Amber feel very cautious, because she knows what she really is. And while everyone admired this ostentatious relationship, Anna kept asking her daughter how things were going at the Duke's palace. Amber was so confused by her mother's behavior in public that she didn't notice how everyone present was standing and watching them, as if they were expecting something. Without giving her daughter time to come to her senses, Anna continued babbling and suddenly started talking about how she and Jim should come to visit them, but Amber didn't know how to convince her husband to accompany her to her house, because recently he had told her he didn't want to see her. She also remembered the conversation at the Emperor's table the night before about the divorce. Looking away from her mother, she clumsily said she would try to persuade the Duke to find time among his affairs. In response to her words, Anna grabbed her daughter's hand tightly, as if implying she had no other choice. And although the mother's grip was strong, extensively she kept the same kind expression, having freed herself from her mother. Amber said she would go alone to her parents' house. The girl remembered the time when she had a younger brother. From that moment on, no one paid attention to her. To her father and mother, she was a dirty spot in their family. Anna punished and mocked Amber in every possible way for any misdeed she thought she might have committed. One day she locked her in a dark room with a small window for talking to a girl from a poor family that day. The mother showed her true face that reflected all the hatred and rage. Instead of her name Amber, she more often heard the nickname Ungrateful Girl, and not even the words of apology could lessen the strength of the mother's disgust toward her daughter. From her memories, the girl remembered how Anna did not recognize her as her daughter from their first meeting, and if Amber had failures and defeats, her mother was only happy. The mother also did not neglect to limit her daughter's food intake if she committed any fault. Returning from her memories, Amber decided that even though she and the Duke already had a bad relationship, she would not fight with him because of her parents. Gathering courage, she turned to her mother and began to speak, but her mother interrupted her. Anna pretended to express regret for the fact that the Duke could not visit them. Ignoring her daughter's look of astonishment, the mother continued, expressing understanding about Amber's husband's busy schedule. The girl still did not know what to answer her mother, and taking advantage of the moment, she asked her daughter to help her take the fan out of the carriage. Anna took Amber by the arm and dragged her almost by force with her, and as was customary in society, when the ladies left, the ladies present began to discuss them. The carriage was parked right next to the road, so Amber and her mother had to walk a bit. Approaching the carriage, Anna asked the girl to help her get in, and when Amber began to help, her mother seemed to accidentally kick her. She did not expect such an act from her mother and screamed in pain and closed her eyes. The woman continued with her harassment, saying it would be a shame if a scar remained on the girl's beautiful face. But as soon as Anna saw the employees pass by, she became a loving mother again and asked Amber if she was hurt. When the girl tried to get up, her mother offered her hand and told her to take it. Quickly the daughter understood why her mother was pretending, because to everyone she was the ideal wife of the Marquis and mother of the children. While Amber thought about her mother's behavior, the woman's face twisted with anger, and with no small cruelty, she told her daughter to quickly take her hand. Anna stood next to her daughter and looked at her with contempt. The girl had nowhere to go and took her mother's hand. As soon as Amber found herself face to face with Anna, she threw in her face the phrase that she had no other choice but to bring Jim to her house. The mother reminded her daughter that she had to convincingly play the role they had assigned her. After all, it is thanks to this role that she is still alive. After reminding Amber once again of her duties, Anna left. That night, while waiting for Jim in her living room, the girl remembered her encounter with her mother and didn't understand what she was supposed to do. The silence was broken by a servant who, noticing the lady's state of discomfort, brought her chamomile tea. Taking the tea and sipping it, Amber asked him if he knew when the Duke would return. The servant couldn't answer exactly when Jim would return and left, and Amber began to wonder if her husband would be angry because she had gone to see him. Lost in her thoughts, the girl remembered again her mother's words that she had no choice, and that she and the Duke were obliged to go to her parents' house. Amber realized she was very tired of this life and wanted freedom, so that no one dictated the rules of life to her. Before, it seemed to her that living in anticipation was already something usual for her, but today it became a burden. At that moment, in the Crown Prince's office, Jim and Jax were talking. the topic of conversation was the upcoming Empire Foundation Day. The Duke asked the prince, why this time? It had to be him who guarded the capital and not the Imperial Guard. Jax replied that he had entrusted him with security because he trusted the Duke more than anyone, since he was also part of the Imperial family, and was expecting a positive response. The Duke as usual left without answering. Upon returning to his chambers, Jim passed by the servants and overheard them talking about his wife. The maid told the young man that the lady had been pale during the day and had sent her to bed, but probably should have called a doctor. The young man added that he had brought amber chamomile tea and that the maid had praised him for it, continuing the conversation. They began to joke and carry out their tasks, but when they saw the Duke pass by, they began to greet him and bow. The Duke passed by them silently, and the servants continued their conversation. Jim entered his room and began to undress when he heard someone snoring. He turned toward the sounds and saw Amber lying on the sofa. The Duke was surprised to see her in his room, since she had never been there before, and this sparked his curiosity about what she was doing there. Amber was whispering something while sleeping, and the only word Jim could understand was Mom. Immediately, he remembered how the servants had talked about the lady's poor health and decided to attribute it all to the girl's condition, despite the tense relationship between them. He did not wake her, but gently lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed as if it were something intimate, with an unusual tenderness for himself. The Duke laid Amber in the bed. The girl slept so deeply, after an emotional day, that she didn't even wake when Jim moved her from the sofa to the bed. For some reason, Jim couldn't leave immediately. He stood by the bed for a while, watching his wife sleep. He himself did not leave the room, but stayed there in case Amber woke up and needed something. After a while, Jim heard a whisper. A barely audible girl was saying something. Upon looking at Amber, he realized that she was still sleeping, and thought that maybe she was delirious because she felt unwell. The girl suddenly woke up and sat up in bed, not fully understanding where she was. When she looked around, she saw Jim sitting in a chair, and remembered that she had been waiting for him, and apparently had fallen asleep. But the girl also remembered that she had been sitting on the couch, and woke up already in bed. It really could be that he carried her and laid her down. As if reading her mind, the Duke said that a doctor had come, and had suggested that she had a cold. However, the girl didn't feel any cold symptoms. Most likely she had this condition because of the encounter with her mother. She continued sitting on Jim's bed and looked around. There was a cup of water and medicine on the table, next to the bed, and it seemed that it was the Duke who called the doctor. Jim listened silently, and Amber thanked him for his care and took the medicine. After this, the Duke asked his wife why she had come to his chambers. She didn't know how to start a conversation about her mother's request to go to her house. Jim began to get irritated by the girl's behavior and asked her to tell him the reason for her appearing in his room as soon as possible. As soon as she started to speak, she immediately stopped and mentioned that they were husband and wife. The Duke responded by saying that Amber didn't need to worry or be afraid of him in that regard. But she was still confused and decided it would be better to leave now. However, when Amber decided to get up and leave, Jim got very close to her and leaned in, placing his hands next to hers. Taking the tie of her dress, he pulled it and said, "Why don't we spend time as husband and wife now?" Amber got scared and asked him to stop, but Jim didn't think about stopping. He continued whispering to her about their bodies getting closer, about how they would share that warmth between them, while leaning over Amber. The Duke looked at her mischievously and asked if that was what she wanted. At that moment, the girl got scared. She didn't know what to do or how to stop Jim. She simply asked him to stop. Seeing the girl's fear, the Duke stood up and moved away from her. Amber said she only came to talk and didn't want any of that. After those words, Jim felt a little disappointed, but continued listening to the girl. Covering herself with their dress untied in front, Amber asked if she could visit her parents' house with him, as her mother had requested. However, she added that if he couldn't, it was no problem, and headed to the door. Jim was surprised by such a request, but what impacted him the most were the girl's words that she was trying to protect him. When Amber approached the door, she began to lose consciousness, and the next moment, she didn't understand how she found herself in the Duke's arms. He lifted her abruptly but with great warmth and carried her back to the bed. After putting the girl in bed, Jim said she should stay there and that he himself would go to another room. Amber, she didn't understand where so much worry from him was coming from and asked him why he was doing that. But the Duke replied that he could think whatever he wanted and left the room. There was a maid standing at the exit of the room, and Jim ordered her to call the doctor for his wife again in the morning. Amber stayed there lying down and couldn't believe that all this was happening between them. He called a doctor and caught her when she almost fell, and although there was no love in his gaze, there was still something tender and trembling in it. She didn't know what the Duke really felt, but she hoped that someday he would remember her as that little girl. Closing her eyes, Amber felt Jim's embrace again, which was really very warm and comforting. Meanwhile, the Duke went to take a bath and also thought about Amber. He remembered her words about protection and chuckled to himself, thinking that she would protect him if she herself was losing consciousness from feeling unwell. The next morning, they traveled by carriage to Amber's parents' house. Amber was still surprised that the Duke put aside his business and came with her. They sat facing each other, but Jim didn't want to look at her and preferred to turn toward the window. Amber remembered how a servant came to see her in the morning and told her that the Duke had finished his affairs and was ready to accompany her to her parents' house. While she wondered why he had done that, Jim distracted her by asking how she felt. The girl showed satisfaction with the Duke's attention and care, and thanked him for it. It was very sunny outside, and Amber thought that maybe it was because of the Duke's presence nearby that the weather was so clear. When they arrived at Amber's house, they were greeted by the Marquis. Morgan expressed his surprise because, despite the Duke's tight schedule, he found time to meet with them. But Jim wasn't so sure and responded curtly that the Marquis knew he was busy and had ordered him to come anyway. The old Marquis ignored the Duke's words and suggested having tea in the garden. While the tea was being prepared, Amber took Jim around the castle and showed him the paintings that the Marchioness so appreciated. The Duke, with all his grandeur, passed by the paintings and looked at them until he reached one of them. The portrait showed little Amber, at the same age when they met. The girl added that her mother didn't like that canvas because it was often hung for display. Jim looked at the canvas silently and said nothing. While the Duke examined the painting, Amber looked at him and decided to ask a question. She didn't know where to start the conversation, but really wanted to know why he did that. And just as she had started to speak, they were interrupted by a servant who announced that the tea was ready. However, the Duke did not ignore her attempt to ask a question and asked again what she wanted to ask, but Amber had already changed her mind about asking the question and said it didn't matter for now and that she would ask another time. The girl hurriedly left the painting room and urged Jim to follow her to the garden. For him, it remained a mystery what exactly she wanted to ask him. They went out to a garden where there were many statues and servants moving back and forth. The Marquis appeared immediately and began asking the Duke what he thought of the castle, to which Jim replied that there were too many paintings there. Morgan began to admire his wife and how much she loved art. She especially esteems the painting that depicts Amber, his beloved daughter. Upon hearing these words, the word lie escaped Amber's lips. But fortunately, no one heard her. As soon as the father saw his daughter, he asked her to go with him for a while. Under the pretext that he had bought her many jewels and dresses, he left his courtiers with the Duke so he wouldn't get bored, and also suggested that he study the proposal for the city's business. Morgan led his daughter down the alley to the depths of the garden and began asking how the Duke was, and if he was behaving too strangely. The father emphasized the phrase about strange behavior because he was worried that Jim had found someone on the side. Amber didn't know what to answer because the Duke is always very busy, and all she knows is that he is always on duty. The father was not satisfied with his daughter's answer and began to pressure her, asking what she was doing in the mansion, and if she had given him the medicine he had brought her. The girl decided to pretend that she had completely forgotten about the medicine. The father was beside himself, with anger at his daughter's words. Without giving Amber a chance to say anything, her father threatened that if the marriage with the Duke broke off, she would no longer be his daughter, and that she must give birth to Jim's child if she didn't want to be abandoned like her mother and rot alone. But what affected the girl the most were the Marquis' words, that if she couldn't, she should use the potion and take it by force. Morgan didn't even listen to his daughter, but told her to obey him and do as he said. Amber could no longer listen to her father's punishment for seducing the Duke and using the potion. Having said everything he wanted, the Marquis let his daughter go so Jim wouldn't suspect anything. Amber ran as fast as she could to get away from her crazy father, and there was only one thought in her head: to get rid of the potion as quickly as possible. The father called the courtier as he watched his daughter leave. He ordered the servant to bring the potion and give it to Amber, but without the Duke finding out. However, the Marquis didn't realize that the Duke's advisor was behind the bushes and heard everything. Soon Jim and Amber returned to their castle, and each went about their own business. The girl went straight to her chambers and began looking for the potion, but she couldn't find it. She asked her servants if they had found the bottle, but the servants were only afraid that the lady's thing had disappeared and that she could be blamed for it. She began to justify herself, saying that none of the maids would have dared to take anything from Amber's room. And then Jim appeared in the room and with a strange smile asked if they had lost something. The girl was very surprised by the appearance of her husband, since he had not visited her before, and upon his arrival he told her he had many things to do. Amber began to stammer in surprise and could not utter a single word, but then the Duke took out that same bottle before her eyes. At that moment, the ground disappeared beneath Amber's feet. She didn't understand how the potion ended up in the Duke's hands. With the same smile, he asked if she wanted to tell him where and why she had the vial of drugs and aphrodisiacs. The girl couldn't answer anything. She was scared and confused, and the Duke kept pressing. He accused her of pretending that behind her sweet face there was actually a terrible and calculating essence. But the Duke felt something for her for the first time, the day he discovered her in her chambers. Then he watched her for a long time, while she slept and murmured something in her sleep. Jim remembered how long she slept and didn't wake up, moaning in her sleep, as if she were dreaming something terrible. And only after a while did she wake up, and through the sleepy veil of her eyes called the Duke, whose pure and innocent gaze still remained before her eyes. How much she reminded him of the old Marquis. But at the same time she had many differences with him. The Duke remembered the moment when he decided to find out roughly the reason for her appearance, and how scared she was and how her fragile body trembled. He even felt guilty for his actions at that moment, seeing her trying to recover from what happened. He also couldn't understand what she was trying to protect him from, and in general, how a fragile girl could protect someone. Despite the tense relationship between them, it was with her that Jim felt pity, guilt, and confusion at the same time, and that worried him a lot. The day they visited Amber's parents' house, the Duke met with his advisor, who overheard the conversation between his daughter and her father, the advisor, recorded part of the dialogue and gave the recordings to Jim. After reading the notes, Jim was very surprised at how calculating his wife turned out to be. The advisor also expressed his opinion that the Duchess was like a beautiful flower with thorns, and it was better not to trust her, otherwise one day she would point a sword at him. With that note, Jim left and the advisor stayed at Amber's parents' castle. Jim, as always, went first to his palace and found the same bottle in Amber's room. After showing it to a local doctor, he was surprised. It turned out to be an aphrodisiac. The doctor didn't stop there. A narcotic component was also found in the bottle, which makes this potion very dangerous. According to what they told the Duke, these vials are distributed among some aristocrats and are very hard to get. Jim even laughed for a moment at his weakness, trying to trust this girl. Amber distracted him from his thoughts and continued explaining something incoherently, but Jim no longer cared about her words. He tore off the mask and felt much better, because the slightest feeling for her had disappeared. The girl couldn't let the Duke leave. She ran after him, trying to stop him. Due to the tears streaming from her eyes, while running she stepped on the hem of her dress and almost fell. She begged Jim to believe that she had no intention of using the medicine, but was running to the room to throw it away. But the Duke interrupted her story. He was no longer interested in her justification, and his slightest interest in her had disappeared as well. From that moment on, he had no reason to respect her. Jim's last words took Amber by surprise, and she lost all hope of convincing him otherwise. Alone again, she couldn't move. The only strength left was to stand, staring at the closed door and crying. Amber remembered the first time the Duke appeared in her life, and in him she saw the hope of a better life. Whispering something unintelligible, the Duchess fainted by the door, behind which the Duke disappeared. A servant came running to her aid and tried to bring Amber back to her senses, but the girl didn't even move. She kept whispering something, as if delirious. The Duke was already far from the door where he had left Amber, but he could still hear the servants shouting. The next day, the girl sat on the stairs and remembered the situation that had happened that morning, and the Duke's words. She looked at her hands, that still felt as if Jim's hands were on them when she stopped him. The Duke didn't want to see her, much less talk to her, after she had deceived him. But Amber still wouldn't calm down. She begged him to talk to her, because she wanted to tell him something important. For the last time, the Duke pulled his hand away and said rudely that he no longer intended to respect her, and that it would be better if she stayed in her room. Amber felt deeply hurt by the Duke's words, and couldn't move from the spot, with treacherous tears running down her cheeks. But she still tried to calm herself and convince herself that tears wouldn't help in this situation. And the girl decided it would be better for her to do something useful instead of crying. That way, she hoped the Duke would appreciate her actions and allow them to talk. Amber believed Jim had a good heart. That's why he cared for her and took care of her when she was sick. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the words of one of the maids nearby, who said that maybe he had a mistress somewhere. Another maid continued the conversation, saying she couldn't stand Lady Amber, and that's why she didn't want to come back home. The maids went on, gossiping about the Duke and his wife, completely unaware of her passing by. Amber was stunned by the fact that everyone in the palace considered her some kind of evil. She couldn't take it anymore, and ran as fast as she could to her room, barely holding back tears while running. The cruel words of the maids echoed in her head, saying it would have been better if she had never been in the Duke's life. The next morning, Amber sat in front of the mirror. While her personal maid braided her hair, the girl decided to ask Lindsay if she knew when Jim would return and if he would come back. Lindsay wanted to somehow calm the hostess, and said that the Duke had already been late before, or had arrived very late. And to distract Amber from her sad thoughts, she asked the girl what her plans were for the day. Amber said she was going to read in the library, but Lindsay suggested they walk through the market and buy something instead. After thinking about it a bit, the girl finally agreed to go for a walk and distract herself from the current situation. At the same time, Jim and his assistant Luke were talking about the smuggling investigation. Luke reported on the progress of the case and who they suspected. Jim was worried both about the transactions themselves and the participants, so he demanded that his assistant speed up the process. It was also known that there was a large organization that traded in the red light district. Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Eloise, was also involved in this, and the Duke wanted to catch and punish him. Luke understood the Duke's intentions, but warned that the smugglers were well hidden, but he would do the best he could. Jim was willing to put all his efforts into catching Morgan Eloise, and those behind him red-handed. The assistant silently accepted all the Duke's instructions and bowed as a sign of respect. However, he still expressed his bewilderment that the Marquis would be a real fool if he betrayed himself by taking such risks. After all, he must understand that if you play the role of a pawn, sooner or later you will be sacrificed. Jim gave Luke a couple more instructions and let him go, but the assistant was in no hurry to leave. The Duke looked at him questioningly, expecting a question. Luke hesitated a bit and then asked if the Duke would like to assign security to his wife, so Amber wouldn't harm the Duke, since she had been raised by the Marquis for many years. Luke's words enraged Jim, and he ordered him to step away. The assistant was surprised by the Duke's tone and asked again, but it was in vain, because Jim got even angrier than before. Luke said nothing more. He simply bowed and began to leave the office, already at the door. He remembered he hadn't informed the Duke about the disturbances on his lands. Jim did not respond. He just looked at his assistant with a puzzled expression. Amber and Lindsay were walking through the local market when a strange man accidentally bumped into them. The next moment, Amber sees another man grab her maid from behind and cover her mouth. The Duchess was about to scream and ask for help, but the man who had bumped into them told her to be quiet. He told her to be quiet and go with him if she didn't want her maidens to get hurt. But Amber screamed for them to let go of Lindsay, and then the man covered her mouth with his hand. He ordered her in a harsher tone to remain silent. If she didn't want to get hurt, Amber tried to calm down and remembered her childhood and a bouquet of lily of the valley her mother had promised her to make her a bouquet of lily of the valley when she got married. That's why they ended up in this part of the market, where they sell precisely those lily of the valley flowers. The maid, noticing this, asked her if she liked flowers and if she wanted to buy some. Without thinking twice, Amber bought a bouquet of lily of the valley and began to feel much better. After the shopping, Lindsay suggested that the Duchess choose a place to eat something. While they walked through the market rows, the maid expressed the idea that they should have taken a porter, since they had bought many things. It was at that moment that those same unknown men appeared in their path. One of them seemed to push Lindsay accidentally on the shoulder, causing her to drop the office supplies bag and fall to her knees. Amber immediately bent down toward her to see if she was okay. Lindsay was so worried about the fallen purchases that Amber had to calm her. And then she heard the man's mocking tone. The man approached them and looked at them like a hawk at its prey. At that moment, Jimmy Luke were passing through the market, and the Duke noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye and no longer really listened to his assistant, who was telling him about the atmosphere in the domain, as well as about the monsters at the border. Luke, noticing that Jim wasn't listening, looked in the same direction and asked what was happening there. Jim noticed that the stationery items from the bag were scattered on the ground, which was very strange. But putting those thoughts aside, he returned to Lucas and they continued on their way talking. At the same time, Amber and Lindsay were captive by some vandals in the market alley. Amber tried to free herself but couldn't. The man had grabbed her too tightly. A minute later, she felt someone push her captor from behind, and he fell, causing her to fall as well. The blow sent the man flying to the ground and hitting his head, and the Duchess heard the sound of a sword. The man got angry from the blow and, cursing, began to turn around to see his attacker. Amber also lifted her head and was unexpectedly surprised when she saw her husband standing in front of her. Jim looked at her with sadness and anger and asked her what she was doing there. After all, he had already warned her once to stay in her room and not leave the palace. Amber tried to explain herself to the Duke, but didn't know where to start. She seemed so scared that she forgot all the words. Suddenly, she realized that her leg had been badly twisted when she fell to the ground. Before she could think, Jim was by her side and helped her up, leaving her even more speechless. After a while, the Duke's assistant appeared. Luke and Jim ordered him to arrange a carriage. After taking Amber to the carriage, he put her inside and unusually asked her if everything was okay. Having received a positive response from the girl, he turned to the maid and ordered her to return immediately to the palace. Amber understood that if not now, she didn't know when she would have the chance to speak with the Duke. While Jim was giving instructions to the maid, the girl was thinking about how to start the conversation so that he wouldn't push her away again, and finally, she asked him if it was because of her that he hadn't returned to the palace for such a long time. After all, he feels guilty about that aphrodisiac story. Although she didn't want to use it on the Duke, however, Jim didn't believe her this time either, and said again that he wasn't wrong, and that he didn't trust her words. Amber looked at him with eyes so clear, in which one could read a complete lack of understanding of the situation. This look irritated Jim a lot, who revealed the secret to her. From the beginning, he didn't want to take her as his wife. These words hurt Amber deeply. She sat in the carriage and didn't understand why he did that. But she was still able to tell him that she liked him, and that she had liked him from the start. She remembered again their first meeting, how he took her out of the dark room, and how they sat on the balcony. However, the Duke's words that she was wrong brought her back to reality, and Jim walked away, also saying that her feelings were absolutely useless to him. Amber was left alone again, hurt by her husband's words. A few days later, Amber went to the Emperor's palace for the foundation celebration. In the hall, she was received by the Empress and her daughter, who seemed very happy to see her. But immediately, they surprised the Duchess with questions about the Duke. After preparing herself, she said he was very busy, so she arrived early alone. She also shared that since her last visit, he hadn't appeared at the palace, which surprised the Empress and her daughter. However, she almost immediately tried to justify it, saying it was all due to the unrest caused by monsters at the border. The Empress was very kind to Amber and immediately supported her, telling her it would be good for her to spend time in female company. Alexandria also treated her warmly and offered her some tea. During the tea, Amber showed concern for the Emperor's daughter and asked about her health, since she hadn't felt well in the morning. Alexandria assured the girl that everything was fine with her now, but she couldn't say the same about Amber. These words made the Duchess feel embarrassed. She didn't know what to answer, but luckily for her, the Empress entered the room. Emily invited them to join the afternoon mass. If they didn't mind upon leaving, she added that there would be priests there who would pray for expectant mothers, and looked meaningfully at Amber. Upon entering the temple, the Duchess saw a priest standing with a cup in his hands and delivering a speech that made her feel warm inside. Amber lined up to see the priest, but she still didn't know if she was doing the right thing. But when the priest looked at her, she seemed to feel something, and no longer doubted the rightness of her decision. The Duchess approached him and knelt down, at which moment the priest dipped his hand into a container with holy water. Touching her head with his hand, he spoke and blessed her. Amber was still kneeling, crying, when a tear ran down her cheek. Seeing this, the priest decided to ask the girl why she was crying. She looked at him with her eyes, but couldn't say a word, because she didn't know how to explain what was happening between her and the Duke. When the priest saw Amber's face from beneath the veil, he recognized her and asked if she recognized him. But she didn't know him because she had never seen him before. After blessing the Duchess, the priest let her go and began talking with the other girls. When she left, Amber turned to the priest once more, hoping to remember him. The Foundation Day celebration arrived, and the first to greet them was the Emperor's son, Jax. Of course, he made a sarcastic joke about the Duke's absence from the parade, and thought he wouldn't show up at the celebration either. But the Duke refuted his words. Jim said with forced kindness that he couldn't miss the holiday. Just then, drinks were brought to them, and the Duke, to relax a bit, took a glass of wine. After taking a small sip, he added with a smile that he couldn't miss such a significant festivity. For him, ignoring the Duke, Jack's sarcasm, announced that there would soon be a dance, and invited his sister to dance. Alexandria happily accepted because she loved to dance. Jax took his sister's hand and led her to the center of the huge hall. Amber was inspired by her brother and sister's dancing, and wanted to dance too. She decided to call the Duke, but he was absorbed in conversation with someone and didn't hear her. She tried calling him again, but realized it was useless. Amber felt alone again. She stood still and simply watched the dancing couples who were completely opposite to her. The Duke withdrew from the dance to the balcony to be alone, because he was very tired of people's company, but he was only alone for a short time. Amber appeared behind the door. She brought him tea that would help warm him up and eliminate the remaining effects of the alcohol. Jim didn't even turn toward her, showing his attitude once again. Amber carefully carried the cup of tea so as not to spill it. When she approached him and placed the cup in front of the Duke, she told him he didn't have to drink it if he didn't want to. Jim was very annoyed by Amber's care. He didn't want to accept any show of attention from her. The Duchess felt all his anger and hatred, and lowering her head, she shivered, whether from emotion or from the cold. That childish and naive look of the girl enraged Jim even more, but he also saw the pain in her eyes that he caused. However, he didn't want to believe her. She had already deceived him once, looking at him the same way with her pure gaze. Then he asked her about her marriage, if she really believed this marriage would last forever. Amber was frightened by this question. She was very afraid of losing the Duke. But Jim didn't ask that question without reason. He hoped that way she would understand him. She would understand everything and wouldn't bother him anymore with her presence. The girl had nothing to say to her husband. She realized that nothing could improve the relationship between them. After apologizing, Amber bowed and decided to leave. As she was leaving, she stopped and told Jim that she wouldn't bother him anymore. Closing the door behind her, she left him alone with his thoughts when Amber left. The Duke couldn't understand why his words affected him so much, and why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Because he didn't like her. After standing for a while, he decided to leave, but he heard someone's footsteps. A red-haired girl came out from around the corner and said that unknowingly she had overheard their conversation. The Duke didn't like the fact that someone was witnessing their dialogue, and asked the stranger who she was. The girl introduced herself as Missy, the Duke Ephron's daughter, without giving the Duke a chance to respond. She went on and said she could see how much Jim hated his wife. The Duke wanted to get rid of her, but Missy insisted and immediately asked him if he wanted to form an alliance with her family. Meanwhile, Amber was walking down the hallway, wondering what she should do now. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice how she tripped and twisted her ankle. She stopped and lifted the hem of her dress to examine the full extent of the incident. While examining her leg, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her and thought it was the Duke. Seeing the priest in front of her, Amber was surprised. Despite the Duke's silence, Missy kept asking persistently if she wanted to be related to her house. At some point, she realized he didn't remember her, and she felt disappointed, because in childhood, they had talked about their possible engagement. Jim was stunned by such audacity, and asked sarcastically how many times she had been abandoned as a child. To ask such questions to a stranger, the Duke's words seemed offensive to Missy, and she started talking again. But the Duke had already had enough. Without saying anything, Jim decided to leave, leaving the stranger alone. He returned to the ballroom looking for Amber, searching for her with his eyes. He couldn't find her and started to get angry. Her image, her voice, and her hair appeared in his head. He heard her politely offer him a cup of tea. Coming back to himself, he pushed away thoughts about her and began to think he was going crazy because of that girl. At that moment, Amber was still in the hallway with the priest. She realized she had an injured ankle and offered to help her. Before Amber could say anything, the priest began to lean toward her leg to get a better look. Taking the girl's leg, he began to whisper something, after which he said it was quite good, healing with the help of sacred power. After some more spells, he let go of Amber's leg and stood up. The Duchess carefully lowered her leg and began to lean on it, and to her surprise, the priest no longer felt pain, saying he was happy to be able to help. He said goodbye to Amber and began to leave. When she decided to ask him if they had met before, the young woman's question pleased him, as if he had been waiting for her. The Duchess didn't understand why the priest was happy, and then the priest revealed the secret to her. that he saw her when she was still a baby, and that's why she doesn't remember him. The girl was surprised that he still remembered her. The priest also said that when he saw her, she was 15 years old. And now he looks so young because he uses sacred power. Everything the priest said surprised Amber. She couldn't believe he was already 37 years old. While she was amazed by his appearance, he stood and looked at her, as if waiting for the main question. And at that moment, she realized that if he had seen her as a baby, then he knew her real mother. But the priest didn't give her a chance to ask, since it was already time to leave, as if he didn't want to be seen there. Receiving no answer to his question, Amber fell silent again and got lost in her thoughts. Seeing this, the priest stopped and encouraged her, telling her that she was very important to him and that they would meet again soon. These words seemed to give the girl wings, and all the sadness she carried with her seemed to be swept away by the wind of change. Soon the priest left, leaving her in that state. After a while, Amber's father sent her another letter which she didn't open, because she thought that again there would be instructions about the child and the Duke's seduction. She returned to being herself in her solitude, and didn't understand how her father could demand something like that from her. Sitting on the windowsill, she thought that if she got pregnant, Jim would be happy about the child, but what kind of child? Can we talk about if he doesn't even visit her? And constantly, like now he goes somewhere. Amber was about to order that her father's letters be burned, but she remembered that her maid Lindsay was off that day. Realizing she had no one to talk to, she decided to go to her favorite place, the library. While walking down the hall from the bedroom to the library, she encountered servants who bowed to her, but after passing them she heard them discussing the incident with her father's bottle. She was very angry with her father because of him. She again felt like nobody, but Amber pulled herself together and decided not to take all this so seriously, but to distract herself by reading her favorite books. The library was her favorite place. Here she could be herself and not feel so lonely. After finishing reading and closing the book, she realized she was starting to feel cold. Hugging herself, she headed toward the library exit. Amber pulled the door handle, but it was locked even though she hadn't locked it. The girl remembered that when she came here. She used to come here, there were maids in the hallway, but they couldn't lock her up. She started knocking and asking for help, but there was silence in response. At that moment, when Amber desperately tried to ask for help, no one heard her. The hallway behind the library door was empty. The Duchess pressed herself against the door to listen, at least for something behind the door. But she heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. She continued, knocking on the door with all the strength she had left. But the cold was taking its toll. With every movement, she had less and less strength and could no longer move. Leaning on the door, she couldn't understand why she was locked in there. The maids she saw along the way often talked about her and the Duke, and didn't understand why he was really keeping her there. Everyone in this house treated her with contempt and hatred. However, Amber remembered the Duke and thought that definitely he would notice her disappearance. Yes, of course, if he came home. After that, everything was like a fog. She didn't understand if it was a dream or reality, but Jim really found her. Amber felt like she had fallen into a dream, and at one point seemed to walk arm in arm with the Duke. But the next moment, she was alone again in the cold room. In the distance, she heard the voice of Jim and another man, but she didn't clearly understand what they were saying. Amber closed her eyes in frustration, deciding this was just another dream. The Duke approached her when she opened her eyes and asked her with concern how she felt. Amber was surprised that Jim was by her side. He told her he found her in the library and also discovered, with Lindsay's help, that the other maids had locked her up on purpose. The Duke brought his chair closer to Amber's bed and asked her what she would like to do with those who had offended her. He was willing to do anything to punish them for hurting Amber, but she didn't want to punish them in any way. She was too tired. Jim was puzzled, because she had decided to leave things as they were when they had deliberately locked her in the library where she could freeze to death. To this, the Duchess simply replied that she had gotten what she had always wanted. The Duke didn't understand the girl's words and asked again what she meant. Amber gathered her last strength and told him that that was exactly what he had always wanted, for her to disappear and no longer interfere in his life, and he should be grateful to those servants. For their actions, Jim ignored the girl's words and told her to eat and take her medicine while handing her a bowl of soup. Their hands touched lightly. This touch gave the Duke a slight warmth, although he himself still didn't understand why this was happening beside him. Amber broke the silence with a question about his marriage and the Duke's behavior. She didn't understand why he acted that way. Jim listened to her silently and made sure she finished her soup and took the necessary medicine the girl really wanted to get answers to the questions that tormented her constantly. So she stopped eating and looked at Jim. The Duke got up from his chair and told her that he was still thinking about ending the marriage and that her feelings didn't mean anything to him either. However, there was something that tormented him, that is to say, the feeling of weakness when he was near her, putting down the medicine, and a plate with the remains of the soup on the nightstand. He waited for Amber to fall asleep. The girl fell asleep very quickly, either from exhaustion or from the soup and medication. Before leaving, Jim looked again at Amber, who was asleep, and after making sure she had fallen asleep, he left the room. Upon leaving the girl's room, he called his assistant, who was nearby. Jim ordered him to gather all the maids who had locked Amber up, take them to the basement and punish them, and then send them outside. Lucas accepted all the instructions, bowed, and went to find the maids. Jim was furious about the maids' actions and was determined to punish them. As he walked away from the room of Amber down the long hallway, He kept cursing the guilty parties. After a couple of days, Amber felt much better and went down to the dining room to have breakfast. The Duke was already there. And as always, he was sitting with papers, not distracted by what was happening around him. As Amber walked toward the dining room, she noticed that the new maids treated her with great respect. They bowed to her, greeted her, and didn't whisper anything behind her back. According to her maid Lindsay, by order of the Duke, all those maids were punished and expelled from the palace. However, the Duke's behavior didn't change at all, since before he didn't notice her. Anyway, Amber was not happy that he punished them, even though she asked him not to do it. She blamed herself for reminding him of herself again and causing him so much trouble. After waiting a bit, the Duchess decided to ask Jim how he was feeling. He looked at her questioningly, to which she replied that he looked exhausted. The Duke, as always, remained silent and continued studying the papers, even sitting at the same table. They were too far apart and Amber could feel it. She began eating her breakfast, pretending that Jim's silence didn't bother her. The Duke carefully studied the documents that his assistant had brought him in the morning. At that moment, the Duchess distracted him again, speaking to him with her guilty voice, which irritated him. Jim looked at her with tired eyes, expecting another annoying conversation. Gathering all her courage, Amber asked him when he was going to divorce her. This question left him in shock, so sarcastically. He asked if she wanted to go back to her father. As soon as possible, Amber. She was confused by the Duke's attacks and tried to justify herself somehow. However, the Duke had no intention of trusting her, so he hinted once again that he didn't trust her and never would. The Duchess already knew Jim's feelings toward her, but his words still hurt her deeply. She saw before her the daughter of her father, the same vile traitor. Jim reminded him how he wanted to seduce him with the potion, and nothing would change his attitude towards her. The Duke did everything possible to make him understand that he had nothing to hope for and that he should stop trying. Realizing that he was about to burst into tears, Amber looked down, and with words of apology left the dining room. Jim was glad to finally be alone and be able to do his things. After calling the maid to accompany her, Amber almost flew out of the dining room. But something made the Duke look at the girl and feel a pang of sadness. The next day was very sunny, and somehow especially magical. Amber was in her room, waiting for the maid to get ready. When she appeared, Lindsay the Duchess noticed a bouquet of flowers in her hands. Lindsay brought a new bouquet to replace the old withered lily of the valley. She put them in a vase and showed them to Amber, who was sitting very sadly, and did not react at all to the bouquet of flowers. When the maid asked where to place the vase, the girl pointed to the table with little interest. Lindsay did her best to distract her lady from her sad thoughts and suggested taking a walk in the garden. Amber didn't even feel like moving, but still agreed to go out to the garden. The maid kept talking about everything to distract Amber, but she was in her own thoughts. Through her thoughts, the Duchess heard Lindsay suggest that she stop thinking about everything that was happening and devote herself to gardening, but Amber simply responded that the butler could take care of it, and that she herself wasn't sure she could stay there until spring. Suddenly the maids came out from around the corner, and as soon as they saw the Duchess, they immediately began to bow. They didn't raise their heads until she passed Amber, and that made her very sad. She didn't want them to be afraid of her. When they passed by the maids, Lindsay told her that they were the ones who had locked her in the library. Amber simply sighed deeply and moved on. Her maid called her, but the girl decided to ignore her and went on alone. Amber no longer wanted to do or feel anything. She understood that there was no place for her in that house. At that moment, a stranger was approaching the palace, who evidently was in a great hurry. The stranger turned out to be a priest who was at the foundation celebration, approached the palace very quickly, as if he wanted to meet someone as quickly as possible, but also to avoid being noticed. Amber was already in her room. The maid was fixing her hair. A servant entered the room and announced that the Duchess had a guest. She was surprised and couldn't imagine who it could be, but deep down hoped it wasn't her father. When she entered the sitting room, she wondered who it was and was pleasantly surprised. In front of her was the priest, whom she had met at the foundation party. He came to her because he was very worried about her and also wanted to talk. He also reported that Lady Alexandria, she was worried about her. Amber was glad to hear that because she had completely forgotten what it was like to have someone worried about you. After talking a little more about the Emperor's family, the priest noticed sadness in Amber's eyes. To understand the reason, he asked if he could greet the Duke. But the girl, as if following a script, replied that he was not in the palace, that he was busy with his affairs as always. The priest remained silent, but seemed to understand everything. The Duchess, as a true hostess, invited them to sit and have some tea. While they sat on the sofas, Amber expressed her gratitude because the priest had come to see her. In response, she received mutual feelings, as well as a question about what made her feel so sad. According to the priest, her sadness made him feel uncomfortable. Amber was surprised. No one had ever spoken to her, never with such tenderness and sensitivity, much less had anyone worried about her. To calm the girl, the priest said she resembled her real mother a lot, and that he was there when Amber was born. He extended his hand and offered to take hers. Amber cautiously extended her hand toward the priest, and when their hands connected, something magical happened. Light sprang from their hands, filling the entire living room, and growing brighter and brighter. At that moment, Amber's soul and heart felt warmer and calmer than ever before. The priest smiled warmly and reminded her that he could heal with power. He also told her that she was the first person he saved, and then God rewarded him with divine power. His mother called him at the birth, and the first blessing in her life was that the baby would be the happiest in the world. Amber let go of the priest's hand, and he asked her if she was happy now. She squeezed her hand against herself and simply looked at the priest. The girl didn't know how to answer him. The priest noticed this and said it was his fault if she was not happy. The next moment he began to take something out of his pocket, saying he had wanted to give it to her for a long time. The box contained a pendant that held his power. He said that Amber was special to him and he wanted her to have the pendant. The priest placed the pendant in her hand, and she immediately felt the warmth emanating from the pendant. Amber was in a state of surprise. For the first time, someone had entrusted her with something so valuable. The priest said he wanted her to be calm and joyful, and the pendant would help her with that. The Duchess hugged the pendant, thanked the priest, and truly felt warmth and peace in her soul. The priest wanted to say something else, but before he could, the Duke entered the living room. Jim was surprised to see a priest in his palace, especially with Amber. When the Duke approached them, the priest introduced himself. His name was Thomas. However, despite Thomas's goodwill, Jim remained cold and immediately asked why the priest was there. With all his kindness, replied that he had been sent by the princess, Heir Alexandria, who was worried about Amber's condition and asked him to visit her. The Duke did not appreciate those cares from Alexandria. The care of anyone was generally foreign to him. Amber tried to act confidently and not show her emotions. Later, she offered to take Thomas to a room after dinner where he could rest. From that day on, the priest stayed at the palace for a while and blessed every room. Amber was grateful for his presence. Even if brief, it made her feel better. Every day it got colder, and Lindsay suggested calling a tailor to take her measurements and make warm clothes. The maid noticed that the Duchess began to feel and look much better. Amber noticed that the butler was nearby and that there was someone else beside him. When they reached them, the other man had already left, and the butler seemed a little confused. He said a letter had arrived from Marquis Eloa. Amber's face darkened immediately. She understood what kind of letter it was, with more instructions from her father. She reached out her hand to the butler and asked for a letter so she could write a response immediately. But the butler told her the letter was addressed to the Duke. This was a surprise to Amber. Her father was scheming something again, and she needed to find out exactly what. She reached out again insistently, her hand toward the letter, and said she would deliver it to the Duke herself. The butler was a little confused, and Amber, to be more convincing, pretended to be the real hostess and demanded the letter in a commanding tone. The butler had no choice but to give her the letter. When she took the letter, she asked if he knew where the Duke was now. When the butler said Jim had his own country house, she was surprised because Amber knew nothing about it. After ordering a carriage, she headed to the Duke's country house. On the way, she thought a lot about what the Duke really felt, what he really wanted from her, and why he hid so much from her. While Amber drove toward the country house, Jim was talking with Duke Ephron and his daughter Missy. Duke Ephron offered the Duke a divorce from Amber and convinced him that marrying his daughter would be beneficial for him. Jim listened attentively and did not interrupt. Thinking about what Ephron really wanted from him, Amber had already arrived at the country house and was confidently heading toward the entrance. While walking down the path, she thought that probably this was the place where the Duke conducted his state affairs. Approaching the door, a bright red-haired woman came out to greet the girl. They almost collided at the door and both began to apologize, still not knowing who each of them was. Amber felt uncomfortable near the stranger and wanted to find the Duke as soon as possible. But the girl was in no hurry to let her into the house and asked if Amber was the Duke's wife. The Duchess, with the same awkwardness, replied that she was indeed the Duke's wife and began to wonder if she had seen that person before. The girl introduced herself as Missy, the Duke Ephron's daughter, and also with a certain boldness, she asked Amber what she was doing there. She was surprised by her boldness, speaking to the Duchess like that. Gathering all her inner strength, Amber said that this was the house of His Majesty the Grand Duke and demanded to know what she was doing there. Not wanting to give up her position, Missy responded in kind, with the same arrogance that they had come to see the Duke and discuss some matters. Furthermore, the Duke Ephron's daughter had no intention of letting Amber into the house, explaining that the Duke was busy with an important conversation with his father. Continuing to mock, Missy added that she knew Jim was thinking about ending his marriage with the Grand Duchess. Amber was left speechless at such attacks from a girl she didn't know at all. But she had no intention of stopping there and advised the Duchess to prepare for divorce and maybe even find someone to replace the Duke. Missy approached the Duchess and looked her in the eyes with victorious authority. After looking at Amber for a couple of seconds, the girl decided to leave and confidently began to walk away from the house. The Duchess began to remember the words of the maids about the Duke possibly having a mistress. Could this girl really be his mistress? The idea scared her and she grabbed the pendant. After an unpleasant conversation, Amber decided not to look for Jim and returned to the palace. At that moment, the conversation between Duke Ephron and Jim ended, and each went their own way. The Duke's assistant, Luke, headed straight to his office, and passing by Ephron, he heard him insult Jim. Luke noticed that the Duke Ephron clearly did not like the dialogue with His Highness, and remembered the words thrown at Jim, just in case when he entered the office. Immediately, he asked why the Duke had rejected Ephron's offer. Jim sat there lost in thought, and did not answer immediately. An hour earlier, the Duke Ephron and his daughter Missy had come to see him. They requested a meeting, supposedly about a very important matter. The proposal was to dissolve the current marriage and marry his daughter. This way Jim would gain his benefit and finally free himself from the imperial shackles. Ephron tried to convince the Duke that the Emperor was not acting in his favor, since he had spent his entire youth fighting for the Empire. He also forced him to marry the daughter of a marquis who was loyal to him against his will. And now the Duke has the chance to dissolve this marriage, because that's not what he wanted. Jim heard everything, but with his usual smile, asked Efron why he assumed he wanted to end the marriage. Efron didn't immediately understand the Duke's tone, and so he implied that they were alone there, and there was no need to pretend. He also added that his daughter had recently heard that you wanted to end your marriage with the current Duchess. This conversation was starting to irritate Jim, and expressed his dissatisfaction with Missy, comparing her to a mouse that climbs everywhere. Missy was not entirely happy with the comparison, but Efron paid no attention to her. He was willing to indulge the Duke in everything just to marry his daughter. Efron mentioned once again that the possibility of marrying his daughter would be a good opportunity to get rid of the Emperor's shackles. Jim did not want to respond to Duke Efron's persuasions, but he did not give in and proposed that they condemn the Duchess for a crime and find some compromising materials. Jim was starting to get tired of Efron's words and was beginning to get angry. The Duke continued praising his family, comparing it to the Marquis's family. Jim couldn't stand it, and calling the conversation tedious, he concluded that Efron was simply trying to impose his daughter on him. He didn't understand how his current marriage was different from the one being offered to him. Efron tried to dissuade the Duke but had little success. Jim remembered Amber and their recent conversation. During breakfast, when she asked him when he would divorce her, she was so innocent and sad at that moment. But at the same time, joining the Efron house was not a bad idea, but the Duke still didn't want it. And then Jim expressed his decision. He was not going to divorce Amber. And then he asked Efron and his daughter not to bother him anymore with those trifles. Jim confirmed Luke's words, that he rejected Efron's offer. Luke didn't understand why the Duke was doing this, because it was a good opportunity to annoy the Marquis. But Jim didn't want to hurt anyone he didn't need to. The assistant clearly didn't understand what was happening to his master, and decided to ask him a couple of questions. He reminded the Duke that Amber was the daughter of a vile Marquis, and that the Duke himself had recently wanted to dissolve that marriage. Jim didn't answer him. He simply wrote something silently on his papers. Luke watched the Duke closely, waiting for a response, but Jim was not going to answer. He only said it was late and time to return. Luke had no choice but to follow his master. The Duke himself didn't understand what was happening to him. Lately, he had been thinking very often about Amber, even now walking down the hallway. He remembered her image, her hair, her trembling lips, her eyes full of pain. He kept having memories of the moments they were together, or when he saved her, and each time, an incomprehensible confusion. And a strange tremor arose in the Duke's heart. That's why he decided not to dissolve that marriage for now, but to put in order the feelings that had arisen. Amber walked down the hallway, remembering Missy and her words about the Duke. The girl's words stayed engraved in the Duchess's mind, and she repeated them over and over. At those moments, when her soul was heavy, Amber automatically grabs the pendant and feels better. A little later, the Duke confidently walked down the palace hallway. The servants, seeing their master, immediately began to bow, and the butler announced that dinner was ready. But the Duke did not pay attention to them. He was heading to Amber's room. Suddenly, the bedroom door opened, and inside was someone she did not expect to see. Amber sat on the bed and couldn't believe what she saw. She looked surprised at the man who suddenly approached her. This man turned out to be a Duke. He approached Amber and asked her what she was doing. The girl replied that she was simply sitting and waiting for him to give her something. She handed him the letter from her father. Jim was surprised by the letter, but when he noticed the Marquis' seal, he decided it made no sense to open it. Jim took the letter from Amber and thought for a moment. After a minute of silence, he asked if she had eaten dinner, to which the girl replied no. Then Jim invited her to come down with him and have dinner. The Duchess was surprised by her husband's behavior, because for the first time in their life together, Jim invited her to dinner. He waited silently while she got ready for dinner. On the way to the dining room, Amber wondered what had happened to him, that he had changed so much. She was sure he wanted a divorce, and Missy's words confirmed it. But she did not understand what was happening now. Jim walked majestically ahead, and Amber, lost in her sad thoughts, followed him silently. A long time had passed since that night, but the Duke's strange behavior had not yet ended. Amber was in the greenhouse talking with the butler. They were discussing what to order for the winter, when suddenly the door opened. Amber turned upon hearing the familiar voice. Jim was standing in the doorway. It turned out he was looking for her, and was surprised that she had decided to decorate the greenhouse. The butler was nearby, holding in his hands a list of what should be ordered. Upon seeing the list, the Duke asked the butler for it, and began to familiarize himself with it. Amber included her favorite lilies of the valley, to leave her mark on the place. However, when Jim saw lilies of the valley on the list, he suggested also planting other flowers. The Duchess's heart melted at the Duke's wish, and she decided to enjoy the last moments spent with him. The Duke looked intently at Amber but said nothing. She looked at him delighted, and dreamed of seeing the lilies of the valley in full bloom. When the Duke began to leave, he ordered the butler to place vases with lilies of the valley throughout the palace. Amber was lost in her thoughts. She thought about how she felt better, and how everything in the castle was starting to look different. She remembered life in the capital and that there was no winter there. It was warm, she liked winter very much, and that there was so much snow here. Jim was surprised that the girl talked so much today, According to the girl, it was all thanks to the snowy weather that lifted her spirits. However, the Duke was surprised that frozen water had such an effect on Amber, but no word could ruin her mood. She continued looking lovingly at the falling snow. Here the Duke turned to her, looked at her thoughtfully and started a conversation, but then was interrupted by Lucas's shout, who was approaching them. The assistant had rushed to inform her master of urgent news. The news was that the monsters had reappeared at the borders, and the soldiers needed the Duke's help. Jim was a little sad, because he would have to leave the palace now. Amber had no choice but to watch the Duke leave and wonder what he wanted to talk about. She understood that the relationship between them had changed a little, but she didn't know why that had happened. Suddenly the Duke slowed down a bit. He turned around and told her to dress warmer while walking without him. These words warmed her heart, but the Duke added that if she caught a cold, she would get sick again and cause him additional problems. But there was still some care and warmth in his gaze. Amber thought he would say more, but he said nothing else. And after that he and his assistant left, and Amber watched them leave. And she was already beginning to miss the Duke. 2 days had passed since the Duke's departure. There was no news, and the girl was worried about her husband. Amber was in the living room, having tea when her maid Lindsay entered. Lindsay reported that the Duchess had a visitor, and it turned out to be her father. She didn't expect to see him and sensed inside that something unpleasant would happen. The girl went to see her father as quickly as she could, because she knew he didn't like to wait. When she entered the office where he was waiting, her father was standing with his back to the door. Amber asked her father with a feeling of guilt what had made him come so unexpectedly. But the father, without answering, turned sharply and slapped the girl on the cheek. This blow was a surprise to Amber, because she didn't even understand what she had done to deserve it. When she fell, her father remained over her with haughty severity. His face twisted with anger, and asked her what she was doing there, and why the Marchioness wasn't pregnant yet. He yelled at the girl for not answering his letters, and how she dared to ignore them. He didn't let her say a word, and she couldn't respond at all. While her father was over her, then the butler entered the office, hearing the noise and asked if everything was okay. Her father immediately changed. When he realized that his behavior could be seen by strangers, the Marchioness, with a kind face, kindly informed the butler that his daughter had fallen. Apparently she was still weak. He extended his hand to help her up. When he picked up his daughter, he pulled her close to him and told her she was too thin, and that it was no wonder the Duke was cheating on her, and so the butler wouldn't suspect anything. He asked with paternal concern if she was eating well. However, the butler prevented him from talking to Amber, as he wanted, and asked him to prepare tea to warm his daughter. The butler went to prepare the tea, and the Marchioness continued holding his daughter firmly by the shoulders. As soon as they were alone, he began to treat her roughly again and dragged her to the sofa, threw her onto the sofa so hard that she hit her hand on the armrest. He began scolding her for her insubordination and accused her of allowing the Duke met with another family. Amber could no longer hold back her tears, and so her father wouldn't see her pain. She lowered her head, shouted that the Duke had met with them to break off his marriage with her. The girl replied that she knew about their meeting, which enraged her father even more, and he grabbed her by the chest. The father continued, insulting his daughter, and hit her in the face again. Amber let herself fall onto the sofa, and her father reminded her that if the Duke abandoned her, she would no longer be his daughter. But she didn't care. She simply replied that he could do whatever he wanted, which made the Marquis's face turn purple. The girl just wanted him to finally leave, and leave her alone. The Marquis hit his forehead, saying he just needed to hear it, and then everything would be fine. And once again he told her that she needed to get pregnant by the Duke to save the marriage. However, Amber responded to this, saying she was not going to have a child. Against her will and the Duke's, the fact that his daughter contradicted him made him very angry, and he hit her in the face again. Amber's face already had deep and painful abrasions. The Marquis finally realized what he had done, and understood what it would lead to if the Duke saw her in that state. After all, he is still a man, and she could easily seduce him, and her father didn't care how she did it, whether by herself or with the help of an aphrodisiac. Amber was so full of sadness that she had no strength to respond to her father. She only thought it was truly a shame to have the same blood as this man. When the father left, the maid entered the office, and was truly horrified when she saw Amber's face. Lindsay had always been very kind to the Duchess, and that was what upset the girl the most, seeing her like that. The maid immediately ran to her and began to examine the abrasions left by her father. Completely horrified, she began to moan that it was necessary to quickly apply something cold to somehow bring Amber to her senses. Amber took from the dresser the pendant that the priest had given her. When she took it in her hands, she remembered the priest's question about whether she was happy now. She felt very sad, and a small tear ran down her cheek that she couldn't hold back. Clutching the pendant against her chest, she wondered if she had ever been happy, and the answer to what she needed to do to finally be happy came to her. A little later, the Duke walked quickly along the path toward the palace. He was busy restoring order at the borders, and it took him a few days longer than expected. On the way to the palace, he saw Amber dressed only in a dress and a scarf over her shoulder. When he saw her, he thought about how rebellious this girl was, that she would get sick again.